Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this conversation about the future of policing in the District of Columbia. I'm Kathy Patterson. I'm going to be your moderator for tonight. This is going to be a conversation, and we thank the Council for Court Excellence for putting this together. We want to be as informal as we can be, and we're going to be turning this conversation into an edited transcript and then a report that we'll publish. So I hope all of you who are with us tonight find it informative. There's a lot of experience and expertise around the virtual table, and we're hoping that the audience tonight, as well as the audience of our report, will find it informative and also see this as forward movement in improving community safety in Washington. I'd like to ask each of us to introduce ourselves briefly by name and by our connection to these issues. And I'll start. Again, as I said, I'm Kathy Patterson. I'm DC Auditor. But to the point of tonight's conversation, I served on the DC Council for 12 years from 1995 to 2007, served as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And in that time, I led 2 year-long investigations of the Metropolitan Police Department. And I was the principal author of 3 rounds of legislation in 2000, 2002, and 2004, looking at police reform across a broad variety of issues. So let me turn to our participants tonight and ask them to do a similar introduction. And can we start with you, Chanel?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chanel Autry. I'm a native Washingtonian. And my connection to this issue is I used to be a public defender in Baltimore. And then for almost 5 years, I worked at the DC City Council and was working for Kenya McDuffie on the Committee on Judiciary. And at that time, we worked on the NEAR Act. So I have some experience in the legislative reform that has taken place in the city.
Thank you. And Bob?
Yes, my name is Robert Bob. I had the pleasure of serving as the subcommittee chair of the Police Reform Commission. I'm also a former city administrator for the District of Columbia, working under the Anthony Williams administration. And I've been involved in police issues in municipalities across the United States, having served as city manager in a number of urban jurisdictions.
Thank you. Kanethia?
Great evening, everyone. My name is Kanethia Austin, and I am the proud mother and activist of my late son, Marquise Austin, killed by DC police, June 12, 2018. I am seeking full transparency and authentic accountability against Black lives.
Thank you. Monica? Oh, did you want to say more, Kanethia? Oh, okay. Monica?
Thank you. I'm Monica Hopkins. I'm the executive director of the ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, of the District of Columbia. I have led the ACLU of DC for the past 7 years, and the ACLU, I think of it as sort of a 3-legged stool. We do public education and outreach, doing Know Your Rights presentations about interactions with the police. We also have been deeply involved with our council and legislation around policing. Specifically, we have done work around the NEAR Act and the Comprehensive Bill on Policing. And then, of course, our 3rd leg of our stool is litigation. And so we have been party to litigation against the city and police practices and the lack of implementation of the NEAR Act.
Thank you. And Pat?
Hi, Kathy, and great to be here tonight. I'm Patrick Burke. I'm the executive director of the DC Police Foundation, which is a small organization started by Mayor Williams and Charles Ramsey to basically support the police department. And the majority of our work is really building trust with the community and working with youth specifically in police programs. I'm a 31-year DC resident where I live with my wife and 4 children. And also I did 27 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, retiring as an assistant chief where I oversaw training and recruiting. And prior to that, I was the assistant chief of Homeland Security under Chief Lanier. I retired in 2016 to work as the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia under President Obama, and consequently resigned to work at the Police Foundation in 2017. So it's great to be here.
Thank you. And Christy.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I am a teacher at Georgetown Law School, and I also served with Robert Bobb on the Police Reform Commission. I've been doing police reform work for a couple decades now. Before coming to Georgetown in 2017, I was in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, investigating police departments and negotiating consent decrees and trying to implement those consent decrees. So thank you again for having me.
Yes, I understand you're on CNN earlier today, so we're honored to have you here on this webinar. I'm sorry I missed them. Thank you, everybody. Let's start our conversation by asking everybody to answer one question, a sort of simple one, but maybe not an easy one. If you could do one thing fast right now, you have your magic wand and you have 13 council votes and you have the mayor's support, what one thing would you do in policy, practice, whatever, to make things better, to make public safety better in the district? Who would like to jump in first?
I would like to jump in and start this off. The one thing that I absolutely would like to have would be in regards to DC's body camera footage. I would like to have the full unedited copy of the killing of my son, Marquise Austin, so that I could understand what happened during that incident.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, Bob, next.
Yes, the one thing that I would do would be to create an environment within the Metropolitan Police Department wherein there is complete transparency of how the police operates, how the police functions, and that transparency is shared without any editing, as it were, with the community. I think when there is a complete transparency in terms of how the police operate, how it functions, it makes for a better partnership between the police department and its and the community that it serves.
And we're supposed to not be shy, so whoever wants to jump in.
I mean, that's such a tough question. I'm wavering between a few things, but if I had to choose, I would probably say more funding for the Department of Behavioral Health to implement more crisis intervention and working directly with district providers that have expertise in that area to expand their resources.
And one of the things I would look at too, Kathy, I think we could do right away, reading through the commission report, is conduct a legislative review. I noticed that one of the topics talked about decriminalizing some lesser level offenses. I think that's something we've looked at in the police department for years, whether it's citation in lieu of arrest or other alternatives to arrest. Do we need to, arrest people? And obviously we've transitioned to scenario-based training where we give officers discretion, or the police department gives officers discretion on arrests, but there are certain things that maybe could be decriminalized that would, take the police officers that we have on the street and keep people out of the criminal justice system.
And to add to your point, in regards to the decriminalization, primarily in the urban communities, whether that's shoplifting, unlawful entry, oftentimes homeless individuals in DC, they are using the restroom outside. They are entering places where typically they are seeking to keep warm. And so definitely instances as such should be decriminalized.
Monica, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chanel hit this on the head. It's such a hard question to answer with just one thing. And it shows how multiple things sort of have to happen at once, which is it really is the beauty of this police commission report that lays it out. I agree with what other folks have said. And I think, one of the things is accountability. So I would add to sort of Bob's, transparency piece and say, without accountability, transparency may not be such a great thing. And that's how all this works together.
And Christy?
Well, I always tell my students not to fight the hypothetical, but it's hard for me not to push back against the question because I don't want to encourage people to cherry pick.
Please do.
Yeah, I don't want people to cherry pick. And I think one of the reasons we're in the mess we're in is that people, we don't address the need for reform holistically. And, so it's really hard to pick one thing for that reason. I have to say, I've got to go with Ms. Alston's desire for her. If I can wave a magic wand and make it happen quickly, MPD is reflexively not transparent, and there is no reason why the mother of someone who's been killed shouldn't have access to the complete video of what happened. So she said she can help understand a little bit better. So I that's the very first thing I would do. With a little more time, I think I'd go along with Chanel and get, I'm not sure if I'd have to look at, and this is why it would take a little more time. I'd want to look at the data to see which calls are taking up more of MPD's time. But I would be between a sort of a generalized first responder, like a Cahoots model, or a mental health crisis response, because I think that would do a couple of things. I think it would reduce a lot of human harm and pain that happens when we get the wrong response, when we get a police response. I think it would get buy-in from police officers so they understand that a lot of these changes can take care of calls that they know they don't want to respond to, they know they're not particularly good at. And I think it would just allow us all it would allow communities to see that there are ways of getting help that don't require a police officer with a gun and a badge. And so I think a first responder model, I'm not sure if it'd be mental health specific or more generalized response. I'd want to look at the data to see where we would do the most good. But I think that is where I'd start off my efforts.
I mean, that was a major part of the Reform Commission's package of recommendations, is really moving to a different kind of responder system. And you mentioned Cahoots.
Yeah.
You mentioned Cahoots. Can you say, for our broader audience, say a little bit about what do you mean by that broader emergence, that first responder?
Sure, and I'll note that the call for a co-responder response, a mental health response, and a generalized first responder model isn't just something that the commission recommended in its report. It's something that was in the NEAR Act that was passed 4 years ago that is supposed to be here already. That if you look online, all those boxes are checked off, all the NEAR Act has been done, but it hasn't. So this is something the people of the district voted for, and it's something that's being done elsewhere, and it's saving lives, and it's taking time back from police and putting them in for people who can better respond to those calls and leave police to the things that are more apt for police response. Cahoots is now very famous model coming out of Eugene, Oregon, a small community, but they decided to start to basically channel a lot of their 911 calls, not to police, but to a group of outreach workers, people with social work experience, with mental health professional experience, and they would respond to calls rather than police. And they are responding to thousands of calls. If they need a police backup, they call for police backup, but they hardly ever do. And they're alleviating the need for police to respond to those calls, and they're providing a better response. It's, by everyone's account, police and communities alike, it's been a success. And recently it's been emulated in other places across the country. We absolutely need more of that, alongside the specialized mental health response for a really hardcore mental health crisis.
I would just like to add, in regards to the mental health piece, that is such a critical stance that needs to be taken when families are impacted by police that have killed our loved ones here in DC. For an example, when the police came to my home to notify me of Marquise's death, the first thing is they did not even tell me that Marquise was killed or died or he succumbed from his injuries. They just said that Marquise was involved in an incident that occurred on yesterday. And then they gave me a Google printout of the DC examiner's office and said, you can call this number and see if your son is here. Now, clearly, that identifies that a huge need for MPD to collaborate with mental health in regards to notifying individuals of their loved ones being killed by the police. And then when I went to view the body camera footage, there was no mental health available for me. And actually, MPD, the night before we were due to view the body cam footage, they eliminated my pastoral assistance that was going to come for emotional support. They limited me and said I could only bring 3 individuals from my legal team with me.
Before we go into what this should be like, can I ask Pat to just jump in and say what should have happened? Obviously, what Kenneth experienced isn't what should have happened, but in terms of what are the current rules for MPD that weren't followed in the notification and the outreach and the social supports? So what should have happened?
Well, just from a human perspective, Kathy, just showing compassion in any case, that's, goes beyond any policy. So, it's to have somebody there, a pastor or somebody, even at the time of the notification, I'm not sure if MPD has something that, or a certain reason that wasn't in place at the time, but it's obviously something to look at. But I do agree, on the larger issue, when we think about the criminalization of homelessness, drug use, vagrancy, and some of these things that we can take police out of, obviously police. I remember the first time I made a death notification, it was a traffic issue, and I was a traffic. Worked at Special Operations Traffic Division and had to meet with an aunt and an uncle to identify 2 young children that were killed with their parents in a traffic crash. And I have to admit, Kathy, at the time I had no training for it and I was absolutely unprepared to deal with it. And it was a traumatic situation for me as it was for the people that we had to notify. So I think that's, even from that perspective, that's something we need to work on. But rule number 1 is always show compassion. It's, we value human life and it's a tragedy regardless of the circumstances.
And how do we get there from here? How do we get to a place where the training is such, or the recruiting is such, that that's a part of it? I mean, one of the things that the commission's report goes into in some detail is the whole transitioning to becoming guardians, not warriors. That was from 2015 from the White House report that our former Chief Ramsey was one of the co-chairs of. So what are the pieces either that the commission recommends or that y'all would like to talk about that sort of helps us move in that direction?
Well, Kathy, if I may, the commission went real deep in its findings and its recommendations. And I think, Christy would agree that the individuals who served on that commission felt very passionately about our community and our city. And they understood the advantages or disadvantages or how law enforcement functions and works in the city, and made a very conscious decision to work alongside, to hear the voices, not only of the residents of the District of Columbia, but also the voices of the Metropolitan Police Department as well. It's interesting that we've come a whole an entire circle because a decade ago, the Surgeon General for the United States recommended that violence in our community be treated as a public health issue. This was decades ago, and now today we've come full circle, and we're looking at not only the police but how the police responds to issues within the community and those areas in which we do not need a police response. And I think I would really encourage members of our community who are interested in policing issues to dig deeply inside the recommendations of the Police Reform Commission, as well as recommendations that have been made to from the ACLU, from other community-based organizations, and compile that information, synthesize it, and then let's move forward as a community to make our cities much safer than it is today.
Yeah, and I would just love to jump in here and say, one of the things that, I'm flashing back to 2015-16 when I was working on the NEAR Act is, we put in there cultural competency, bias, anti-bias training. We put in recommendations for, making sure that these things happen on an annual basis and that there are refresher courses. And what came back at the time was, X amount of money, if the amount of money that it would cost to conduct all of this additional training, it just wasn't feasible based on the budget. And so, that is one of the things I think is very just telling and frustrating to me, is that we have to figure out how to realign budgeting. And I like how the report talks specifically about realigning budgeting over the next 4 fiscal years to figure out what makes sense. And I think we also have to be real about, how deeply we go into the recruitment process and think very strategically about, is this person really psychologically capable of being a police officer? Are they going to be able to react in a way that when it's a high stress environment, it is not trigger first? They're going to be able to use the training that they have received to de-escalate. And, are they amenable to this community? Does it make sense to move an officer laterally from one jurisdiction to another and put him here? And can he adapt? I think we have to really think more critically about the recruitment process, and then also about the lateral moves that do happen and how they happen.
If I could just, if I could just add a couple of things. There in the report, it talked about, communities, and the police recruitment process is part of that, but also where these police officers actually live, right? And it is very easy to not understand the community that you serve, see the community that you serve as, it creates sort of an us and them dichotomy. And then when you pair that with the hyper militarization of police, and we look at like the increase in policing, and the militarization of police, that is sort of how, when we talk to communities and how they feel they are being policed, they use terms like it is an occupying force, that they come into communities like this. And I don't think that serves the communities when they do need help. I don't think that it serves the police. If they really do feel that their function is to help with public safety, they have to be able to rely on community members to turn to them. And so I do think that militarization piece is one thing, but also, really understanding the communities that they serve, not just because they put on a uniform and go to that community, but they really have gotten to know that community on a deeper level by living in the district.
I also would like to add that a couple of things that the MPD needs to do, which is at the forefront. They need to be accountable. They need to provide full truth and integrity for the community that they serve. MPD, they must admit their wrongdoings. So if you are trying to provide public safety to a community, in order to engage and interact, you first need to deal with the wrongdoings that you have done, that you have created in these communities that creates the dysfunction, the split, the divide between community and police officers. Instead, the community having to demand accountability through protests, through being on the front line, that should not have to take place. We should not have to demand truth. That should come to us, especially as family members of those killed by the police.
I mean, one of the big, go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, and I think what Kamenetz is saying, it's so interesting. She said that first this has to happen. And if you actually look at the 2015 21st Century Policing Report from the Obama administration, that's actually the first pillar, right? Like that police actually have to recognize how communities have been policed. And I think that what Kamenetz is talking about is it's the same in relationships. When we have a relationship with any person, if you have, if there is a history of wrong, we need to acknowledge it, and it needs to be upfront, and that is the only way that you can sort of clear the decks to say, okay, how do we move on from here, and where do we go, and how can we reimagine this, and how can we co-create together to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish.
And I agree with that, Monica. And I do believe that police need to, in order to earn and maintain respect and trust, is to be guardians of the community, and once again, consider themselves members of the community. One of the challenges, I think when I left the department, Kathy, in 2016, we had about 25% of officers living in the city. And I think it's less than 20% right now. And that just a reality is, I've been fortunate to live here for 31 years and throughout my career, but I was fortunate to take advantage of the HPAP program, which gave me tax abatements and some incentives to buy my first house. It's tough to live here. It's expensive. I talk to young cops all the time. They would love to live in DC. They can't afford it. It's tough. I'd love to have them here, but I'd love to see some incentives. And I know Vince Gray talked about some income tax abatement and some other initiatives, but let's get serious about talking how we can get cops to live in the city beyond the cadets that we're recruiting from DC.
Kathy, I'm somewhat, yes, I'm a little bit of an optimist in that. I think with the new leadership within the Metropolitan Police Department, given all that has occurred, the fact that we have someone who grew up in the city, who came up through the ranks of the police department. So I'm optimistic that some of the transparency issues that we're discussing will be, that will be a breath of fresh air. And if there's not, we have members of our commission, they're not shy about, and also the community, about advancing, those issues around transparency. And Kathy, as a former council member, I'd just like to make one comment with respect to funding. When we had a housing issue in the district, we created the Housing Production Trust Fund. When we had an arts issue in the community, I believe they've created a public arts fund. So with respect to the commission's recommendations, why not create for the next 5 to 10 years a police reform commission fund that provides funding to implement these recommendations of the commission, those that are agreed to, and then work in conjunction with community-based organizations and hold those organizations accountable. Because what we find is that the community-based organizations candidly are on the front line in the district. Not just the police are on the front line, those community-based organizations are on the front line and bring a tremendous amount of expertise in terms of how to make our community better and how we serve. So as the city council, goes through its budget process, create a specific fund, give it a 10-year funding guideline, because that's what it's going to take, I think, to really show measurable results. And I'm just taking 10 years out of the air, but it needs to have a dedicated funding over a period of time to implement these recommendations and take them outside of the normal budgetary process, much like the Housing Production Trust Fund.
There is, coming to the district on a 3-year timetable, $2.2 billion from the American Rescue Plan, some of which probably should be used to beef up some of our behavioral health infrastructure. I could see some of that sort of helping us get out of the pandemic, helping us get out of this other epidemic that you all have been dealing with in terms of violence. So there may be some synergy there, not over 10 years, but maybe over the 3-year time frame of that federal money that we're getting. But I take your point. It is something to, when you're trying to create a new part of the infrastructure, you're going to have to come up with the funding to do that. Absolutely.
I just want to lift up that what a lot of people have been talking about is the need for housing and a conversation about the future of policing. And I don't think that that's any accident. I think it really underscores how we've come to over rely on police for our public safety needs without recognizing that shelter and housing is a public safety need. And we put so many dollars and so much of our hope in law enforcement rather than housing. And we know the commission talked about, for example, that one of the reasons that women who are survivors of domestic violence return to their abusers is a lack of housing. We know that living on the street is a stressor that can push people living with mental illness into crisis. And when people do have crisis, if they have a home to be in, you don't need to get the public involved. We absolutely need workforce housing so people can live near where they work, but we also need housing for people who have been here for many generations who are having to move out because they can't afford it anymore here. There's a lot of investment we need in housing, and that is a public safety need. And I think we need to start to recognize that connection because we're not going, that is a much better way to stop violence than stopping and frisking. Right? It's not as obvious to us because it's been normalized that this is how you keep us safe. But no, housing keeps us safe.
I love that the holistic mind you bring to this, Christy, and also it's not just housing too. Like I think it's good for us to all sort of step back and say, what does public safety mean to me, right? Like that's the best starting place. And for me, it means, being able to know that I am safe in my home, to be able to cross my street. And I'll just say I've gotten more involved in traffic issues on my streets, but that's public safety, right? And you can see when those things happen in a community, our response is we want to feel safe immediately. And so the knee-jerk response is, rather than say, okay, what's at the root of this? And how do we actually build an infrastructure where people can feel and know that they are safe with housing and resources and community and a network of support? We're like, I need to feel safe right now. And I'm, let's call the police to sort of watch the traffic in front of my house. That's the easiest thing, rather than saying we need to advocate with DDOT and put more funding in DDOT for, traffic calming measures. So actually people can like cross the street and commune with their neighbors and check in on each other and things like that. So I think all of those things are tied, as Professor Lopez said, to public safety and what it means for public safety. Public safety is not the police.
Janelle, did you want to jump in? Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm
And that's
sorry.
that's why I think the police department, would feel great to have social service agencies and these other safety nets in place so that the police don't have to be the responders to everything. And one thing I took reading through the commission report is everything is training. And as police have evolved, we've implemented crisis intervention officers to train officers to deal with mental health issues. So as Christy was saying before, if we could have support systems in place that would preempt that or keep the police from responding or come up with some sort of evidence-based solution that's working in Oregon or something else and implemented here, I think the police would be elated not to handle those situations unless it's a dangerous situation.
I agree.
What is the extent of?
It's important. I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's so important to also talk about the long-term care planning, because that was also mentioned in the report. And, crisis intervention is needed, but when someone has a mental health issue, it doesn't just go away after that initial crisis. There may be long-term care and long-term treatment plans that are needed to assist the individual in living with a healthy and productive life. And so we have to think about more permanent supportive housing. We've got to think a little bit more about crisis beds and other ways in which we can be supportive of people who are struggling with even co-occurring disorders. I mean, I think it's just amazing that we're talking about this because, we're right in the beginning of Mental Health Awareness Month, and what better way to talk about that intersection than to be talking about how that impact affects policing.
from the work of the commission, do you have a sense of the capability of our mental health professionals, our behavioral health structure? If we're looking at major expansions in order to provide more services, but also to take over some of the functions that we have been looking to police for. Did they weigh in terms of the commission's work, in terms of their own readiness to essentially take on more?
Is that a question for me?
If anybody.
Oh, I mean, I would say, and of course we have the experts here who actually authored and co-chaired the committee, but I found it fascinating to read that there were, I believe at one point there was a kind of talking about crisis beds and like the availability of only 16 crisis beds at one facility or at some facilities. And that's just not enough, right? We don't have enough in place to help people who are in need and who need those services and who need wraparound services. And they talked a lot about, you know, the BIPOC community and the need to have more BIPOC providers who can assist with those intersections and be able to deal with issues that arise. But, you know, I will leave it to Professor Lopez and Bob to, of course, to talk about it. But I was fascinated by this, the need for additional resources that was included in the report. It highlights that we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, I would agree. There is a lot of work to do. What we've done is we've identified those areas where there really is a need with respect to mental health services, 911 system. You know, if I could just put on my kind of what I do hat, and that is you sit down intentionally and you map out the current services in your current state, and then you say, this is what our future state would look like in terms of services, in terms of resources. And that is something that I'm hopeful will take place as the city council goes in the city administrative mayor's office with its budget. I mean, you have to break these silos down and say, what can we provide this year? What do we need to provide next year? You have to develop that roadmap. And if it's not done, then, you know, we're just back where we were in the beginning. And I would also add, and Christy could attest to this, when we looked at the issue of having, you know, removing the footprint from the police from the school system. And you look at the ratio of security officers in the school system versus mental health workers versus social services versus school counselors. It's, you know, it's not an equal game, as it, you know, for lack of a better definition.
Well, why do you think that is?
I think that, I would confess, some have been a victim of it, as well as not here, but also in Detroit when I served over that system. The first thing we looked at is, oh, the schools are not safe, so let's put in more cops, so let's put in more police officers. And at the end of the day, the schools still are not safe. But what happens, what we find, and what we have experts on our commission, and we heard from from students, what we find is that when the police enter a school building for an offense, I don't mean an active shooter situation, it tends to escalate those, the issues by virtue of the fact that there's someone there with a gun. And the officer-friendly program can take place off campus. The police and, all of those, the athletic league, all of those things can take place off campus. Working with the community-based organization can provide the safe passages for students. But we have to fund those other basic needs based on national standards within our school system. And we tease that out in our report. Fortunately, we had experts on our commission who understood kids and students in our school system.
I would like to jump in. Kathy, you asked, why is that? Anti-Blackness is embedded in official practices that was authorized by the Supreme Court and embraced by law enforcement policies. So in order for policing, for an example, to be reformed as a city, DC, first, again, acknowledge the wrongdoing and accept the initial reasoning. Police were even instituted in the 1700s. Patrol groups were created to stop runaway slaves. And so this is how all of this came about and how it even still exists here in 2021. And so furthermore, for an example, every single study finds Blacks don't commit more traffic offenses than any other race, but they are disparately stopped by the police. We have examples, Dante Wright, Sandra Brown, Philandro Castile. So, and here we are in 2021 experiencing the same notions regarding the police. MPD and their stop and frisk exclusively to Black and Brown communities. Their jump out tactics in urban and project communities. Like, so again, we have to be truthful and acknowledge that these instances do in fact exist. And then let's dismantle those systematic systems.
Can Christy or Bob, can you want to speak to the commission's recommendations on that point? I know you do talk a lot in the report itself about getting into some of the institutional, systematic kinds of issues that Kamenetz is identifying.
Yeah, I think Ms. Alston said it best. That, when she talked about how anti-Blackness is sort of baked into the system, and I think one way to think about that is that I think everyone really wants kids in schools to be safe, but if you really have to ask yourself, if these schools were full of middle-class white kids or even poor white kids, would you really think the best way to sort of create the kind of safe educational atmosphere would be to, hey, not have fewer than the number of social workers, mental health workers, and teacher aides than the national standards say you should have, and instead put those dollars into police and metal detectors? It's as if we feel like these kids respond to different stimuli than white kids. Whereas I really think that if these were white kids, I don't think that anyone's deliberately doing this because they, are racist or maybe someone is. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is we have been acculturated to think that these kids respond to different stimuli. And if these were white kids, we would be like, oh my gosh, these kids need support. These kids need, better playgrounds. They need more social workers. This kid's definitely having a hard time getting to school. But instead we're like, oh, truant, let's call in the cops. Right. And so I just, we don't take the approach we would take if this country's history had evolved differently. And I think we have to confront that and recognize the continuing impact it still has. It's really pernicious in schools. And my friend, my colleague, Professor Chris Henning at Georgetown, really talks about this, how we've criminalized normal adolescent behavior. And we do that especially for kids of color. We don't let them be kids, and we instead treat them like little criminals. And we have to really be honest with ourselves about why we do that. Give ourselves some forgiveness. We're all baked in our history of our country, but admit it and move forward and recognize it and have a better way of supporting these kids.
And that better way of supporting is?
Well, what Bob was saying at the beginning, and I love him. I mean, one of the things that's been so great about working with Robert Bob is his ability to learn from what he's done and to say, hey, I did it wrong before. Let's do it a different way. And I hear the same thing coming from Mr. Burke here today. Hey, we were doing it wrong. Let's do it a different way. And we just need everyone to be a little bit better about that. And so Bob says, hey, I used to think the way to keep schools safe was to put more police in. No. The way to keep schools safe is to give kids the supports they need. And that's what we say in our report. We also talk about just reducing the number of interactions between police and youth, because guess what? Research shows that those are actually criminogenic. What that means is the more police contacts between police and kids, the more likely those kids will commit crimes in the future, right? You're actually that they kind of live down to expectations when you treat them like that. So we have a lot of recommendations about that. It's not pie in the sky, naive, kids are just wonderful. We've all been dealing with kids that can be rotten, they can be annoying, they can be awful, they can sometimes be violent. But that, we've got to learn to deal with them as kids. Their brains are developing, they're growing up. And research has shown in other places they're doing things that's allowing kids to grow up, to get through those rough years without being in prison without a criminal record, without hurting somebody or being hurt. And we can do that if we just trust that these kids will respond to the same sorts of supports that kids everywhere do.
And Christy,
And I would just add to that, like, even when we're talking about young adult offenders, we have to be very mindful of that too, because the brain does not stop developing until around the age of 25. And a lot of times we like to say 18 hard stop, like you're done, you're an adult. And yes, technically you're legally an adult, but your brain is still developing at that age. And so we have to also, as we're thinking about treatment for that population of 18 to 25, be mindful of that as well.
Can I just jump in there real quickly, just because it's so true. And there's a reason why you can't rent a car until you're 24, or all sorts of other things until you're 24, because the actuaries know that. When they look at the data, they're like, you're not actually a responsible adult until you're about 24, right? We know that, but we're still treating kids in that in-between stage as if they're the same as a 35-year-old. We actually recommend increasing the age of majority in the Police Reform Commission report to 21, but we ran up against reality and the concerns from advocates and from attorneys about their ability to represent people in the juvenile system. So we if you read our report, you'll see that we caveat that, but it's exactly that idea. We need to have our decisions driven by science and by facts rather than just the way we've always done things.
And Christy, the school scenario is another area where the police are once again called upon for everything, and the answer is more police, more police, more police. So I think, I think police agencies nationwide would acquiesce to the philosophy that let's have more support systems where they're not needed. If there's there's no violence and not a need to have them in there because they are supported, then that's great. And once again, it gets to what are, police shouldn't be brought into discipline issues in school. That should be handled internally or with folks inside. So once again, the police are called upon to deal with things that they may not necessarily be trained to deal with in an adolescent atmosphere.
Absolutely.
One of the, on the redefining childhood up to 21 proposal, one of the things that Chairman Mendelson said when you all released the report was that he said some of these proposals are kind of edgy, and he used that word. How receptive do you think the broader community is going to be to the proposal of defining a child up to the age of 21? I understand what you're saying about the science, but in terms of how do you present that to a wider public? How do you share that information in a way that can be persuasive?
Well, that's why I'm here tonight. I think it requires all of us, and it's not going to happen overnight. But we have to, start to just let people know that, it's about public education and outreach. And I think that the more people understand this, the more that they'll realize it's not that scary or strange or weird. It's just the way, that the world can actually work better and be safer if we take that approach. But it's not an overnight thing. I completely understand when people are like, that is really wild. I cannot accept that. We're all going to be safe. It takes some time, and I respect that. But we all have a responsibility to learn, to be open to these ideas, because people are being hurt and lives are not being lived as fully and as well as they could be if we would take the time to accept some things that are hard to accept and try some innovations that we've never tried before. I always say no one required a randomized controlled trial before we embarked on mass incarceration. We just did it and hope for the best, right? We shouldn't require the same sort of randomized controlled trial to this innovation will work. Let's just try something humane and see how that works. And try something that's supported by evidence and science and see how that works. And I think that I think other communities are doing that, and we can do the same thing here in DC.
As we have those conversations though too, Christy, I just think it's important to make sure victims are heard as well. I think we all want to support youth at ages and 20-year-olds, but when we think about violent homicides and some of the reprehensible criminal acts that are taking place, people are hurt, and we need to hold people accountable at some stage as well. So when it comes to egregious violations, sometimes we have to keep people off the most dangerous people off the street, those recidivist violators that have a propensity for violence and hurting people.
Even if they're 17.
I think that one of the things here is, there are several reports that have come out, like the police commission report, also the jails and justice report. And I think the danger when we start talking about these reforms and then going immediately to sort of like the worst case, the two things, like worst case scenario about incredibly violent, offenders, and talking about victims in a very narrow sort of, you're either, have either been victimized or you are the offender. In a lot of these communities, it is not that simple. And additionally, what we hear too is that police interactions, when someone is the victim of crime, that they have been treated by the police as if they had some participatory action in their own victimhood. So I think that this is a really complicated situation. And to Christy's point, and what I heard her say about Bob too, of like, I did this and then didn't work, is I think all of us need a little bit of humility of like, maybe we don't have all the answers here. And both in the policing context, the prosecutor context, the sort of the entire pipeline of the criminal justice system, we have to get better at being a little bit more humble and saying we need to learn more. We need to look at what we have been doing. So if you look at, when we did our policing hearing, when Councilmember Allen did the policing hearing in Deanwood, and we were talking, people were testifying about the jump outs or the gun recovery units. We heard in the background, someone would be testifying and there would be, older community members in their 70s being like, oh yeah, the jump out boys, we've known them since the 60s, this, whatever you call it, over time, we've been doing the same things over and over and over. And I think it was maybe Einstein who said, like, you keep doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. That's like the definition of insanity. And so I think it is time to learn, and we have to complicate this notion of victim and only the victims being served, because a lot of times that is a much more complicated definition.
Well, we have to hear the powerful voices of Ms. Austin and others in our community who, have personal experiences, but also have recommendations in terms of how we can police our community better. And then we need to hear from the police as well, because the police have to be at the table. And as Christy said, we don't expect all our recommendations to be embraced overnight and taken forward as any commission's work. But we were intentional in that our commission, when we came together, we came together with the intention that we aren't creating, we want our report to be evidence-based. So if we where we made recommendations, we gave you a roadmap to go find the references so that you can learn not from just what we're proposing, but what others have proposed as well. And so my hope is that there will be a coming together of, the community and the police, the advocacy community, and that may be a pie in the sky thought. But we're not going to get better if we're marching into our own individual silos, and we're not opening up our eyes, ears, and hearts and listening to the Ms. Austins of the world and the other individuals within our community who felt the pain of how police impacted their personal lives. And so, and then, and the police needs to be at the table as well. And I'm just hopeful that, Kathy asked the question, how are we going to roll it? Well, we have the rollout. We have all these other reports, which has been rolled out to the community. And so how do we then bring all of us together in some type of small United Nations for the district and break down all of these recommendations from various reports and say to the community, we now have Jails and Justice report. We have the ACLU's report. We have other communities report. We have the Police Reform Commission's report. Let's bring all these things together and then march in concert, you know, at City Hall, at the City Council meeting to say, we need to move this community forward and do it in conjunction with the police department as well.
Thank you so much, Bob, for knowing that my personal experience, unfortunately, immediate steps we can take to increase ethical policing, again, will be full truth accountability of the harm and the repetitive traumatization MPD has caused our community. So dismantling the corruption that heavily lies within MPD. Oftentimes my experience with MPD, the officers are very arrogant and they are unempathetic with their disposition. Prime example, within this past week, I've attended 2 balloon releases for young men that have been killed by DC police, and only to go to and to support these family members, the police are there. How insensitive. And so when we go to these events, but yet again, we're re-traumatized because when we ask them, why are you here? We are here for a peaceful event. That is triggering. So then I don't want to support the families because yet again, I have to see them with their arrogance. We here just in case something go down. Why would an instance as such happen at a memorial service as such? Another example that I have personally experienced is advocating for body camera footage, the legislation. And so when Marquise was killed by MPD, June 2018, of course, my initial instinct was to confirm these allegations that Chief Newsham stated my son did. I would like factuals on that. And so I was told I needed to request the body cam footage. I requested it. I got no response from the city. So then that is what forced me to seek legal assistance. I got legal assistance. The first response that DC said when we requested the body cam, that Marquise needed to request it. The second response we got was, oh, it's still under investigation. This was 18 months after the incident. Then they said, oh, you need to file a FOIA request. We filed the FOIA request. Then they denied the FOIA request the first time. So all this is going on within a 2-year span, time frame. And I'm still advocating going to city council meetings for the body cam legislation to be amended because they also said, oh, Ms. Austin, by the way, when I went to meet with Council Member Charles Allen, they said, oh, the legislation doesn't say that you can't see the body cam, but it also doesn't say you can see it. So that's a little gray area. So then that's when I began to advocate even more. And then the emergency legislation came about where parents of adult children could view the body cam footage. Then even after that, I still couldn't see it. So I went to meet with U.S. Attorney Carl Racine. And I said, can you please ask the mayor to release the body cam footage? He said, I can't guarantee you, but I'll ask her. So after that, she said she would release it only to me and the 3 individuals that I brought. So all this time, I am still advocating, protesting on the front line and grieving all at the same time. And then the legislation was amended, I believe, last year, May of 2020. And so that legislation stated that body camera footage was to be released within 72 hours and all officers' names was to be released. I have not received all officers' names. I have not gotten unedited version of the body cam footage. I don't even know how the interaction started. So the legislation that surrounds that I heavily advocated for, who holds the city accountable for that? Because they are damn sure not following it or abiding by it. So we create these legislations and these amendments, and we advocate, and I go to the meetings and the hearings, but they still not following them. So what do we do from here? Please tell me. Because I still don't know why the police approached my son. I don't know. That's hurtful. You think about that, your child, you still don't know. You only know the very words that were uttered out of the chief mouth that said, allegedly, this is what your child did. So you will want to know what your child did.
I can put on my former council member hat and try to say, that's on me. You know, I'm your accountability. If I'm an elected official in the District of Columbia and there's a public official in the Metropolitan Police Department or any other agency and they're not doing their jobs, then that's what I was elected to do. And you mentioned that you've testified. I don't know how else other than through the testimony and the keeping the community pressure on our elected officials. It seems to me I think that's the only answer I can come up with, because that is their job to be holding.
And you know, I just have to say, it breaks my heart to hear your pain, Ms. Austin. But you know, one of the things that's so tough about the legislative reform process is it codifies a standard at a particular time, and then it gets amended, right? And so we can see the history of what happens with laws. But then there has to be the effective and transparent implementation. And if you don't have transparent and effective implementation, then you don't get the result. Because we can write laws all day and say X, Y, Z occurs. But if it's not happening, if we don't see it happening, then again, like, you have organizations that have to go forward in lawsuits and, you know, try to hold elected officials to task to get information. And so it is a very frustrating thing. And it is something that has to be more thoughtful and more considerate, because there should not be a reason why you still don't have what you need 3 years later.
No, I think that's another thing. Go ahead.
If I could just add, first of all, Kamenetz, I also just I can never not hear you talk and feel the pain that you still hold. And I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that one of the gifts of our work is meeting, you know, you are here as one mother. And I know that one of the gifts of our work has been meeting the mothers that you are a part of. And I just want to lift them up in this space, because as you say, and I might totally, you know, get this wrong, and you tell me if I do, but you know, you are part of a club that nobody wants to be part of. And those mothers are, it is a strength that we as society, as legislators, as, you know, law enforcement, no one should ask you to bear that strength and fight at a time when you should have the space to grieve your loss. And I share in the frustration when I see folks turn out at council meetings en masse, you know, and share their pain. And I think one of the very telling things that we saw was, you know, when Chief Newsham was up for confirmation, there was a 4-hour confirmation hearing with testimony from the public and people testifying and coming. And then, there were hearings in Deanwood. There were, all of these things over and over. There is the implementation of the NEAR Act that, you have a law enforcement agency who does not follow the law. I mean, these sorts of things, like when law enforcement agencies do not follow the law, then you cannot expect people to say, like, why should we follow the law, right? You are setting leadership role models here, and then having to be held accountable to follow that law by an outside agency. And, I do think that pulling all of this forward, I know that there are multiple feelings about Chief Conti. That, he's from the community, he has been on the force, he is from DC, and he is, you can talk to him about things. We also know that he has run the gun recovery unit. And so we have had conversations with folks, and, and we testified at the confirmation hearing, but it was very telling that it was a very small panel of community members at that confirmation hearing. And what that says to me is that folks are tired. They're tired of not being heard. And so this is, some could look at it and go into this with a lot of hopelessness. But, what I see is that we can go into it with a lot of hope, because there's a roadmap. There is a roadmap here of things to be discussed and a way to come together. And I think we owe it to the mothers like Kamenetz. I think we owe it to community members to do better. We have to do better. And we have to be just as outraged, whether or not that was our child or not.
Thank you. And with regard to the chief, I think everyone knows he was confirmed today. And he also, in response to a report that my office put out, said, yes, we will release internal affairs reports, and then sort of walked that one back a little bit. So there's some accountability challenges there as well. So I think there are some other things that we need to be paying some attention to.
And Kathy, along the lines with what Bob said, Chief Conti, I'm elated personally to see him confirmed unanimously by DC Council. And I think that really shows the overwhelming support for him. And as Bob said, I think the important thing is for the police department to have a seat at the table, to listen to these ideas, to talk through these ideas with Christy, Bob, and the professionals, and hear, once again, those evidence-based solutions, and talk about what the infrastructure needs to be and how we can get some of these things implemented. But I have worked with, and I testified at Chief Conti's confirmation hearing, I've worked with him throughout his career. He really has his heart and mind in the right place to lead our city forward. And I'm glad that council agrees with that. And I think there's a great opportunity to work with the Reform Commission. And once again, as Monica says, doing better. We need to do better.
Chief Robert Conti, a native Black Washingtonian, has been appointed as our chief of MPD. I'm skeptical, I'm weary, and hopeful that Chief Conti's appointment will bring me closer to Marquise's truth. I'm skeptical because Chief Conti's long tenure with MPD and his ineffectiveness to keep Black DC residents safe. I'm very weary because MPD has continued to avoid answering questions about what happened on that dreadful field day. And I'm hopeful, though, because I have to be. To live without such will be an abandonment to my son.
I think it may be hard for you to bring hope here tonight, but I think everybody else, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have some degree of hope. I think that's one of the reasons we want to keep talking, and keep trying to look for solutions. Let me ask you about the accountability issue that was raised. You have mentioned the NEAR Act, and a lot of folks have mentioned the NEAR Act. That's only one of the laws that we have enacted that seemed like a good idea, and yet has fallen short. Let me give you a couple of other examples that are highlighted in the report. One of the pieces that I worked on as a council member was the 2000 legislation. One of the things it did was create a training and standards board, and to try to improve training and oversee training and make sure it was best practices, and did all the things that the community needed training to do. And the report notes that that board hasn't even met for a number of years. So like the NEAR Act, I just use that as another example. There are things that have been enacted, have been put in place, and then fall by the wayside. And that's another thing that I think as a community we need to work on. Anyone have any comments on that, on how to make sure that once something is put in place, we can try to make sure that it stays in place?
I mean, I think you said before, Kathy, as a former council member, I mean, that's the function of oversight, right? Like that is actually the role of the council, is that when legislation is put in place and things are required on an annual basis, that the council holds those agencies, whether it's the police, our schools, DDOT, and what is interesting to watch is what we will accept from one agency and what we absolutely will not accept from another agency. And when you put these two things side by side, and I do think we have to acknowledge that, we do as a society, we have said, oh, public safety equals the police. And to challenge or say, like, you aren't doing this, we have to acknowledge it's a weird power dynamic in that room, right? But we look to our council members to hold these agencies accountable. And so I do think that when that doesn't happen, it is not just sort of, in that case, the police and their lack of compliance that erode trust. It also erodes trust in the legislative process as well.
There's two sides to that question, I think. You have the council. You have the proposals. They go before the city council. It passes legislation. The legislation moved its way in, right or wrong, into the up to the administration. And I remember serving as the city administrator. Anthony Williams had one quote, and that is, the council has made its decision, and it's, city administrator, you take that decision and you implement it and you hold those agencies accountable. I mean, he would say, I'm sending you the letter from the Vatican, which means that, step in line and get this done. So that's the accountability. And then, of course, there's always the fear of going before the performance commission. I mean, your performance hearing, I don't know, maybe not today, but at least during my tenure, because you wanted to show the council that the legislation that they adopted, that you've taken full charge of it and that you've moved it and you're implementing, and if there are issues, then you want to come back and say you need an amendment here or there. And that's, it's not a perfect world, but that's the way it's, I mean, that's even when there is a veto of the legislation that council adopts, once it becomes law, then it's to be implemented. And there's pride in implementing. I want to speak for myself. There's been pride in implementing legislation that made its way from the council chambers into the administration. Even if you disagreed with them, you want to be able to show them that, hey, you know what? I disagree with you, but damn it, here's what we've done to implement it, and this is how we're holding ourselves accountable. I mean, that's the I'm not, this is not some pie in the sky. This is the way it has to happen to bring it. There will always be disagreements between the legislator and the executive. But once there's the old law, and Kathy knows this, the mayor and administration proposes and the council disposes. And once they dispose it, you have to implement it.
And on the NEAR Act, I am happy to say that the Office of the DC Auditor is in the midst of doing a project on the NEAR Act to say, what was the intent? What's been implemented? Is it doing what it was supposed to do? So that'll be a while before that comes out, but we're taking a look at it.
Oh, then the other thing I want to say is the council, when it passes legislation, is also to put the funding towards it, because you can't say we're going to pass something and then you're not going to fund it and then expect that it's going to be implemented. So there's accountability on both sides.
Absolutely. So Mr. Co-Chair and Ms. Co-Chair of the Police Reform Commission, what have we not touched on?
Well, if I can just go back to something Patrick said earlier, I think it was a fair point he was making. I definitely appreciate Monica's point that, we have this, it's not this binary victims versus perpetrators world that we live in. We live with people who are scared and who are trying to be safe. And one day they may be the one committing violence. The next day they may be the victim of violence. And we have to acknowledge that and realize that our systems aren't doing as good a job as they need to keeping people safe. But I think what I heard and what he was saying was, I was talking about the need to sort of be innovative and try new things. And I think part of what he might have been saying is, people in these communities don't want to be experimented on. Like, don't try your crazy ideas out on us. We need to be safe. And I think that, police officers, I've definitely seen the dynamic that Ms. Alston was talking about many times over the years of police officers who are callous and not empathetic and just rude. But I've also seen police officers who are deeply touched by their work and who are pained when they have to go to the scene of a homicide, right? And they don't want, I think they feel like that some of these people who are promoting these ideas don't understand what they see in the communities that they're trying to serve. And so I wanted to make sure everyone's clear that what the Police Reform Commission did is we looked at that. We had victims of who were victims of being killed by the police and people who are victims of being killed by other people who are members of the public. We listened to all those voices, and the proposals we made really are meant to reflect that, right now shootings are going up, violent crime is going up in the district. We obviously could be doing a better job. What we're doing now is not working the way we need it to. And then we looked within that and we saw that some of the neighborhoods, and the data is still really early, and one of the things we recommend is that there be more study of this, but the neighborhoods that had violence reduction workers and outreach workers, the Cure the Streets program, and some of the One's Office programs, they had lower rates of violence, especially homicides, right? It seems to be working there. And that's one of the things that the NEAR Act promoted, and that's one of the things that the evidence promotes, that those sorts of community interveners, people who have been victims, people who have been perpetrators in the past, who understand the neighborhoods and the needs of people in neighborhoods, we can empower them more and they can do a better job than policing. I also want to highlight the other thing that people talked about to us a lot is domestic violence. And if you take the police out, who's going to respond to those calls? We got a really, really thoughtful response today to our report from the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And they didn't agree with everything we said. There was one thing that they didn't agree with us on, but they really agreed with us on the crux. They didn't agree with us about redefining intimate partner to only be to not include things like siblings. Our view is that the power differentials are not the same between siblings as they are as intimate partner violence is meant to convey. But I'm certainly going to frankly defer to them on that decision. But they agreed with us on everything else, including the fact that we need to provide more funding so that there are domestic violence responders who are not police, so that women, mostly women, have the option of not taking the criminal legal route. Some women want that, others don't. They want a different route to be able to keep themselves safe. We talked about the need for housing for those women. So I encourage people to look at their response and to really understand that we We're listening to the voices of people living in throughout DC, including areas that are more impacted by violence. We were listening to people who have been victimized or have survived crimes, and we were trying to come up with solutions that will serve their needs. We were not being reflexive about this or sort of sloganistic about it. We were trying to address the needs that are out there and do better by these communities.
And Christy, I'm glad you talked about funding for a lot of these things, because two of the main topics I picked up in the report were really funding and training that come in so many places. So my big push is to have the systems in place, the funding for these programs in place before police were taken out of it. You've got to have obviously those programs in place. And I'm also glad you brought about the mental health of officers too. When I think, and I know it was mentioned in the report, and I do appreciate that, because when you think about the trauma that police officers experience, I know coming out of college, I wasn't ready in 1989 for my midnight tour in the 7th District in Southeast, where I think there were over 450 homicides that year, and many in the 7th District. And it was, it does change you as a person. And I think to some extent, there is PTSD that a lot of officers experience when you look at the stress, the anxiety, potential for alcoholism and other issues that needs to be addressed. Because if you're not mentally healthy, then how are you going to have good interactions with the public? So we need to take care of our heroes, of our officers, so that they can take care of the public. And I'm glad to see the chief is putting some priority emphasis on that as well.
One of the things we have not spoke about, and I think, and Christy, please chime in here, and that is more transparency within the police department itself, and and shoring up the police. We're proposing a deputy auditor within the police department to audit itself. We're proposing more audit functions within the office of the city auditor to play a more deeper role, because we have to ensure that, getting back to that point of transparency within the police agents, within the police department itself. We have made a proposal with respect to qualified immunity in our report. We've also, one of our other recommendations is that the officers' personnel records be made available and visible to the public. And that, so there are some things within our report that I'm sure will, raise the ire of perhaps law enforcement, police department, and maybe some of the rank and file, but those are issues that, we felt should be brought to the table and have some discussions within the community. And so, my point is that, the report is, as I stated earlier, we drew from a lot of many committees and recommendations from others within the community, and we embraced those and we brought those to bear within the report of the commission. One of the things that I learned personally from our work was the whole issue of sex trafficking in our community. It's something that I had, we've been focused on a lot of other issues, but fortunately we had, the head of Courtney House as a member of our commission, who then brought that valuable insight into how to address that particular, criminal activity within the district. And so there's a much to be unpacked within the body of our report. But again, it's going to take, a concerted effort on a part of the entire community to say, we can agree here, we don't agree there. And if the police department comes out and say, well, we just disagree with the report, then, that in and of itself would speak volumes to the community. Because the report was not an attack on the police department. It was intentional in terms of how to reform with evidence-based reform for the police department, calling attention to some of those challenges that others have called attention to. I mean, we should not have, the ACLU should not have the suit of its own police, our police department, to gain certain information with respect to traffic stops. You know, that should be readily available to our community. And so, anyway, those are things that, you know, I'm pretty excited about, bringing people together. And I just want to make one final comment before we close, and that is, you know, to really thank the members of the commission who did a tremendous amount of work, but also the fact that we embraced the work of others in the community as well. And then of course, in addition to Christy, the resources of Georgetown University was available to us as well.
Well, and we, the community, thank you. It is a prodigious amount of work. And I do recommend people read it front to back. There's a lot there. And did a minute or two for any final words anyone wants to jump in to say before we close out?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, like, one thing that we also have to be mindful of and talk about is how we care for returning citizens when they come home, and make sure that they have the appropriate social safety net as well. I know that, you know, that conversation is one that is difficult sometimes in talking about and figuring out what makes sense to do, but we have to make sure that we're providing adequate support and care and opportunities to sometimes relearn what it's like to live on the street and be a productive citizen once you do leave incarceration.
Thank you. And let me just say thank you to all of you, to Bob and to Monica and to Christy and to Chanel, to Pat and to Kanethia. Thank you for your wisdom tonight. I look forward to the book. Well, you know, we'll sell a lot of copies. No, we won't be selling. And thank you to the Council for Court Excellence for putting this evening together. For anyone who wants to stay, some of us will stay around to field some questions, but let me just close us out and say thank you all for being with us. Thank you. We look forward to the next steps on this very tough but very important subject. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kathy.